Welcome to the church basement. I'm Garrett, and today I want to talk about the lesson of the loaves. Two seemingly unrelated stories take place in the Gospels right around Passover: the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. In the first story, Jesus is preaching to a great multitude of at least 10,000 in the wilderness outside of Bethsaida. As it starts to get dark, Jesus' disciples come to him and tell him to send the crowds home before they all get hungry and starve. But instead, Jesus looks to his disciples and says, "You give them something to eat." Now, the disciples understandably question this seemingly impossible request, at which point Jesus picks up a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish, and somehow supernaturally feeds the entire crowd with leftovers to spare. Immediately after this, the second story takes place. Jesus' disciples get into a boat and begin to sail across the Sea of Galilee, while Jesus stays behind to pray. In the middle of the night, Jesus decides that he needs to catch up with them, so he just walks to them on the water of a stormy sea. I know, you've heard the story before, but it's still incredible. Anyway, the disciples all freak out at the sight of this human-shaped being walking to them on these giant waves. So Jesus calls out and says, "It is I, don't be afraid." And Peter asks if he can walk on the water with Jesus. Jesus says yes, and Peter begins to walk on water for a few seconds until he begins to sink. Jesus saves Peter, throws him into the boat, and immediately the winds cease. Then we are told that the disciples were greatly amazed beyond measure and marveled. Now that seems like a pretty reasonable response, but the Bible disagrees. We read that they marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their hearts were hardened. There was a lesson from the miracle of the loaves that explained the miracle of walking on water, but the disciples didn't understand it. So my question is, what was the lesson of the loaves? What did the disciples not get? And do we get it today, 2,000 years later? Some have suggested that the lesson is that Jesus has power over nature. Simple enough, right? But that doesn't really fit. For one, months before these stories took place, Jesus had already calmed a raging sea. If the lesson was that Jesus had power over storms and waves in nature, why point to the bread instead of the storm? And two, the disciples already knew that Jesus had power over nature. In the previous raging sea story, who did the disciples turn to save them from the storm? Jesus. Why? Because he was the one who could save them. And in the time between the two storms, we also see Jesus demonstrate his power over sickness and death in Mark chapter 5. Everyday people, not to mention the disciples, already knew that Jesus had power over nature. That couldn't be the lesson. So what makes these two stories, the story of the loaves and the story of walking on water, different from all the previous miracles, the calming of the sea, the healing of the woman, and the raising of Jairus' daughter? Now, I don't know if you noticed it, but there were a few details of these stories that sounded awfully familiar. So if we could draw parallels to another story, that might help explain the lesson of the loaves. So let's see if we can figure this out. In a story about crossing a sea, Jesus says, "It is I," which in Greek is ego eime, literally, I am. During the story, people's hearts are hardened, and this all takes place around Passover. Well, that's all from the story of Moses parting the Red Sea. God tells Moses his name is I am, Pharaoh's heart is hardened, that's where we get the Feast of Passover, and the people of God literally cross a sea. The gospel writers very clearly want us to be thinking about that story when we read about the loaves and the walking on water. So what happens in the story of the Red Sea? And how does it connect to walking on water and multiplying bread? Let's take a deeper look. Moses is leading the Israelites out of Egypt, and Pharaoh and his army are chasing them down. They wind up cornered between Pharaoh and the Red Sea with nowhere left to turn, and the people are freaking out. So Moses faithfully declares, "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish before you today. The Lord will fight for you." That seems pretty good, right? He's basically saying God is going to do something to save you. So what does God do? Almighty, all-powerful God looks at Moses and says, "Why are you crying out to me?" Because you're God? You sort of led us here. But for some reason, God thinks that Moses should be able to take care of this. God tells Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? You lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it." God is declaring in no uncertain terms that Moses has the authority to rescue the Israelites, that Moses has power over nature. Through faith in God, Moses can walk in the power of God and do things that only God can do. You lift up your rod, you stretch out your hand, you divide the sea. You give them something to eat. You come to me and walk on water. The lesson of the loaves is not that Jesus has power over nature. It's that Jesus has given you power over nature. And we see hints of this leading up to the story of the loaves and the walking on water. When Jesus calms the raging sea in Mark 4, he tells them that they could have done it if they had had faith. When Jesus heals the woman later that day, he tells her it was your faith that has saved you. A few minutes later, when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead, he tells her parents, fear not, only believe. Their faith was the key. So we have this buildup of Jesus connecting all these miracles to faith. And not his faith, but their faith. Then the very next thing Jesus does is give his authority to the disciples. Then, in the same chapter, they all go out into the desert where Jesus tells his disciples to supernaturally feed thousands of people with some kid's lunch. Jesus is testing them. The Gospel of John literally says that this was a test. He wants to see if they get it yet. He wants to see if they understand that they can do the same works as Jesus. But they don't quite get it yet. So Jesus sends them off in a boat, and a few hours later, he comes to them on the water. Most of the disciples run and hide, but Peter, God bless Peter, Peter gets it. Almost. He asks Jesus if he could get out of the boat and walk on the water with him. Jesus must have been so thrilled. Finally, one of these guys is getting it. So Peter gets out of the boat and walks on the water until he begins to sink. Jesus saves him, throws him into the boat, and then tells Peter why he sank. Was it because it wasn't God's will? Was it because Peter didn't have the authority? No, Jesus tells him it was because he lost his faith and doubted. Peter was so close, but he still didn't quite get it. None of the disciples did. Their hearts were hardened. They didn't understand the lesson of the loaves. They didn't know that they had the authority of Jesus. So Jesus continued to teach them this lesson throughout his ministry. You see it in Luke 10 when Jesus says, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy. You see it in Mark 11 where Jesus says, whoever says to this mountain, be removed and be cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart but believes the things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. You see it in John 14 where Jesus says, the works that I do, he will do also, and greater works than these will he do. We have the same power that Jesus has. We have the same authority that Jesus has. We can do the same things that Jesus does, and even greater things. That is the lesson of the loaves. Have a great week, and remember, you're greater than you realize. There you go. I think we're done.